also author of Woe to Women, The Bible Tells Me So, and the editor of the anthology Women Without Superstition, No Gods, No Masters. And her talk is called No Gods, No Masters, Women versus Orthodoxy.
I first have to say that the hospitality in Iceland is very warm. And I want to thank Kobe and her family, and Carolina and Aya, and to say it is very nice to be in a fundy-free place. Free of fundamentalists for the most part, or at least fundamentalists who are organized. I liked what the ambassador said this morning, that Iceland is an oasis of peace and tranquility in a crazy world. And Siggy, I enjoyed that introduction to Iceland, but it was a little depressing to be an American and see those statistics in the country of Iceland. And some people would say that the meaning in life you have is from solving problems. So I can say that we Americans have a lot of meaning in our lives. And I have to preface my remarks by talking about a kind of silly state church violation that actually has some impact here. We get a lot of complaints around the country at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and we try to work these out without going to court, which is very rare these days. And about a year ago, I got a letter with pictures attached from somebody in a little town in Minnesota, and there was a Celtic cross. It was the strangest looking cross. It had bite marks out of it, and it was supposed to be, I guess, 3 days that Jesus was tortured and these were the bites. And then at the bottom of it was a plaque that said, Odin lost, Christ won. And this was in a public park in front of a museum about Nordic history. Of course, Minnesota is the state that has the largest immigrant population from Scandinavia. And it was a relatively recent violation. It was some Nordic immigrant type pastor who had given this cross and this plaque to be put in front of a museum that had a what do you call it, Stavkirke, Norwegian church. And so I wrote a very forceful letter about this, and it turns out someone had been complaining for many years, but our letter was what finally got the city to take down this crazy plaque. They wouldn't take down the cross. But all I could think is, imagine how threatened these Christians are, these fundamentalists, that they're exulting over victory over a dead religion. Well, then I come to Iceland, and I learned that there are 700 to 1,000 heathens who are supposedly worshipping Odin and Thor again. But my understanding is it's really about the beer. So I guess Odin really did lose. I think that Dan didn't want to step on my toes, so he didn't talk at all about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I'm going to take the liberty of spending about half of my talk about current events in the United States, and then talk about the threats to women. The Freedom from Religion Foundation began in 1976, and it was my mother and myself and an elderly gentleman when I was in college, so this is dating me. And we began when Jerry Falwell was in the ascendancy. I don't know if you've heard of the moral majority. He became a media darling, and the religious right first got some attention, and we thought it would just take a few years for a group like ours to remind the American public that we have a secular nation and that we revere our Constitution, that our founders were the first to adopt a secular, godless Constitution claiming no pipeline from a divinity and investing sovereignty in we the people. And here we are 30 years later, and there's Falwell 30 years later. One of the best endowed law schools in the nation is on his land, and he's churning out religious right lawyers, and so is Pat Robertson. And of course, things have never looked bleaker in terms of the assault against secularism in the United States. So what we thought would be a very short little job has turned into life's work. We went from 3 members at our beginning to 7,000 today, and believe it or not, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is the largest atheist agnostic association in the country. has grown very quickly in the last couple of years, and we hope will continue to grow much more quickly than that. And we work for the separation of church and state. To steal a phrase from the Bush administration, we are poised on an abyss in the United States. We are that first country to adopt a secular constitution. It is the longest lived constitution in the world, and that is no coincidence because it is secular. But I believe we may be about to be the first country to throw away a secular constitution, to throw away the Bill of Rights. Maybe not voting in a theocracy per se, but letting one develop by default. And it would be a mono-theocracy at this point. Americans are, there's so much hostility and ignorance about secularism. Americans think that if it's religious, it must be good. Therefore, why shouldn't the government fund religion? Why shouldn't we have God in our Constitution? I was going to give you a surreal statistic, and of course my thunder has been stolen more than once, that 51% of all Americans reject evolution. And that's the scientific method, if they even knew what it was. In the state of Wisconsin, where I'm from and where the foundation is based as a national group, we have a neighbor who's in the state assembly, and she's introduced a very daring piece of legislation, the first in the nation, to ask that only something that is part of the scientific method could be taught as science in the classroom. Now, she's trying to get this adopted all over the country, but she has no real expectation that this will pass in Wisconsin, which has an F for science education and the teaching of creationism. So that's where things are in our state, in our country. But there's one other study you wouldn't have heard about, which I think is equally appalling, that came out of the University of Minnesota this March. And it was a large survey, it was academic. We have no reason to disbelieve it. It's called Atheist as Other. And the study found that Americans, when they are given kind of a hierarchy of out people, of people who are not in the mainstream, gays, African Americans, Muslims, non-Christians, atheists, atheists are rated at the bottom of the totem pole in social acceptance as not really sharing similar values, as being the people you would be least likely to want your son or daughter to marry. And it's a long study, there's a paper with it, and it's just sort of dismally depressing to read it. And the stereotypes about atheists range from materialistic hedonists who have no morals to being prostitutes. You know, it's just absolutely outlandish. And I talked with the researcher. We have a new radio program called Freethought Radio, and we had her on the program, Penny Edgell. And what was kind of reassuring is that she believes, and the study seems to show, that the people with these stereotypes and myths have never actually met an atheist. It's simply, they are truly the other. So the more we speak out, the better. Most references to state-church separation today in the United States by politicians and the media are pejorative. It's almost as if secularism is a dirty word. And school children were once brought up to revere secular history, and that just doesn't happen anymore. Americans have a notoriously short attention span, but you would really have to be in your 60s to even remember a time when school children did not pledge allegiance to one nation under God. Where our money did not all carry, the currency did not carry, in God we trust, which is a very Johnny-come-lately violation in the 1950s McCarthy era. But people just don't remember. Whole generations have been brought up with these symbols on our money and in our pledge. Is there a Pledge of Allegiance in Iceland? That's really a dumb idea anyway. It was at the behest of the Catholic Knights of Columbus, by the way. But even in 1960, 40 years ago, there was still some reverence for separation of church and state. The candidate, John F. Kennedy, who was making Protestants nervous because he was Catholic and looked like he was going to win, people wondered, is his allegiance truly to this country or is it to the Pope? And Americans all know this very famous speech he gave to a group of Protestant ministers in Houston. I do want to read a few sentences of it. John F. Kennedy, before he was elected, said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to vote, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials. It's almost funny to read these words today. Finally, I believe in an America where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no block voting of any kind. 40 years later, we have lost so much ground. It's pathetic. We have Catholic prelates telling Catholic politicians openly how to act. Many bishops around the country threaten Catholic politicians with spiritual blackmail if they do not toe the Catholic line on abortion, gay rights, stem cell research, death with dignity. The Vatican has, of course, a global order that any Catholic public official must toe the line on these matters or else. And the Catholic Church doesn't even have to bully our current president, who's Methodist. When he was seeking re-election, President Bush flew to the Vatican and begged to have an audience with the Pope and demanded that the Pope do more to get his Catholic U.S. bishops to support him. And of course, the Pope was very willing, and so were the Catholic Conference. Of course, we have limited funding these days of many Catholic schools through a voucher program. It's only in 4 places, but it's going to grow. We are robbing the public schools to pay for it, and the main beneficiary of so-called vouchers are Catholic schools. The United States is now paying the tuition of Catholic students who are displaced by the Hurricane Katrina, which is a lot of students. And it's simply unprecedented, and of course that will affect the law. The religious right is wheeling and dealing in Washington, D.C., manipulating election issues, values, of course, is the euphemism for being anti-gay, anti-abortion, born again. And they manipulate people to vote against their own self-interests and have anointed themselves kingmakers very openly, Dawkins, Falwell. They have veto power over the nomination of the Supreme Court, which is what happened this spring. And the religious right has run amok. We have billions and billions of dollars being funneled into Bush's faith-based initiative, and if government can decide which church or religious group it funds, there is no way to protect against political pandering, and that's all it is. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has taken and won more lawsuits against the faith-based initiative than any other national U.S. civil liberties group. We've won 5 cases. They've been significant. We have 4 more, and we are planning more. But we could take a new lawsuit every day and not staunch the hemorrhage of public money that is going to religion unaccounted for. We have to take it on faith, what's going on with this money. And of course, our country used to have faith in fact-based initiatives. And that is why I am so much in support of the goal in Iceland to end taxed tithing to churches. A very good idea. And it's been commented on earlier that there's this paradox that in European nations that have nominal church states, you have religiosity at an all-time low. And in the United States, with its so-called separation of church and state, religiosity pervades everything. But secularism is also at an all-time high, and that's another paradox. There's something called the American Religious Identification Survey, which is by the City University of New York, and it's definitive. They did a survey about a decade ago that found that the non-religious were 9% of the U.S. population. Now that's not all self-avowed atheists, that's just people saying we're not religious. In 2001, when they came out with their second survey, it's 14% of the U.S. adult population, which is a very significant minority in our country. The Jewish segment is 1.2 or 3%, Muslim is 0.5%, Mormon is 3%. But politicians haven't caught up with changing demographics, and we have very little power. The secular bloc You need to flex more muscle, but it is there. And Freethought has never been stronger, I can tell you, in the United States. I mean, there are Freethought groups and chapters in virtually every college campus. There's just literally hundreds of local and regional Freethought groups. I think we're all growing, but this assault against secularism has just been unrelenting. Let's see. And I think I did mention, we have a little piece of good news in the United States, which is Air America, which is a new radio station. It's in the larger geographic areas. It's largely founded to be sort of a democratic alternative to Fox Network, which is all pure Republican. And CNN is following suit. It's almost not real news anymore. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation has tried for 30 years to have a radio show, to buy time for a radio show, even to buy advertising, and been censored. And for the first time, we have been able just to launch a radio program, and we're hoping, to go national or at least syndicated. And Julie Sweeney, who is not here this second because she's rehearsing for tonight, was kind enough to record a commercial for us, along with some other people, for Air America, and there's been just wonderful feedback. I mean, the people will join you if they can find you in the United States. They just don't know you're there, and that is the most common reaction we have gotten at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I'm the only atheist in South Dakota. I'm the only free thinker in North Carolina. Well, they're not, but we're very disorganized. It's a very large country. It's hard to find each other. And this will make it a little easier. And before I talk about women, I'm sure you know this, but the Christian religious right essentially has control over all three branches, executive branches of government. The presidency, Congress, which is Republican dominated. It's a third evangelical, and probably more than, it's disproportionately Roman Catholic. And to a lesser extent, the U.S. Supreme Court. So our vaulted checks and balances are out of whack. And the most significant part of that is the U.S. Supreme Court, which is 9 members appointed for life. And I'm sure you all know that this fall and spring, President Bush had the chance to appoint 2 new people to the court, Alito and Roberts. And so we now have a Roman Catholic 5-member majority, and that is very worrisome. Alito tipped the scales. He replaced, of course, the moderate swing voter Sandra Day O'Connor. And when Bush nominated him after a failed nomination of a woman that the religious right didn't like, that left only 1 woman on our U.S. Supreme Court. By contrast, Canada has a 9-member Supreme Court, 4 of which are women, including the Chief Justice. So we are really losing ground in the United States. It was just, as I said, a gross insult to women. Globally, we can take heart in the election of Michelle Bachelet of Chile, an agnostic feminist. But the news in the United States and worldwide, of course, is not good for women. There is a religious war against women's rights. And in terms of women, there is a danger of a Christian Sharia in the United States. And this was brought home to us very frighteningly in March by the passage of a ban on abortion in the state of South Dakota, which was signed into law by the Catholic governor. A ban on abortion even in cases of rape, incest, or gross fetal abnormality, only to save the life of a woman, and we know how that would be interpreted, which this was passed not just to hurt women in South Dakota, but it was passed as a test to go up to the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade, which is the Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion nationwide, in the United States. Since 1973, we've had legal abortion. And just this last week, Kathleen Blanco, who is the woman Democratic governor of Louisiana, signed into law, it's a so-called trigger law, which would be banning abortion in the state of Louisiana if the Supreme Court was to ever overturn Roe versus Wade, and in the likelihood that they would say this is a states' rights issue, and it would go back to the states. Now, states' rights is something we haven't heard since segregation days. States' rights is what the slavers called for before the Civil War. So it's a little grim. We think we can sort of hold abortion. One of those Catholics on the Supreme Court is moderate, but has said he's changing his mind on the issue. But if Bush has the chance to appoint one more person to the Supreme Court, it's all over for Roe versus Wade. I have to say the good news here is that women in South Dakota have fought back very well. They got out a petition, and they are seeking to repeal this abortion ban, and it's now on the fall referendum. But we are dealing with an unfair battle because the tax-exempt churches in that state, it will be largely Roman Catholic, can tell their parishioners who to vote for. And the other groups that will be working for this referendum will be lobbying groups. And we've had, they don't necessarily work together, but always in concert. We have the Roman Catholic fundamentalist and Mormon church lobbies, and they are the people who killed the Equal Rights Amendment, which I'm still very bitter about, in the United States. Many of the guarantees of the Equal Rights Amendment have been adopted individually by separate states, but not all of them. And this language, it was, no, I don't have it written down, but that no state should abridge rights on account of sex. And that's the rights of the Equal Rights Amendment that we could not pass in our country due to the religious lobby. We have no ratification of CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, that was adopted more than, was it 26 years ago now, by the UN General Assembly. We have this embarrassingly medieval situation where the United States consistently sides with the Vatican and the Islamist nations at the UN. The global gag rule that was first imposed by President Reagan was repealed under President Clinton, and of course it was reimposed by President Bush, and that has devastated health care and reproductive choices for millions of women worldwide. Catholics are the single largest denomination in the United States, and that spells trouble. After them is the Southern Baptist, that's the largest Protestant denomination. And they are all working to attack secularism, to attain public aid for religiously segregated education, to try to put prayer and the Ten Commandments in public schools, and to fight gay rights and gay marriage, to repeal abortion rights and otherwise legislate their dogma. And I'd like to say just a little bit about this gay rights, gay marriage thing that's been going on in the United States. 19 or not, maybe 20 states have passed bans against same-sex marriage or civil, in some cases, civil unions. And already most states have something written into their state statute that marriage is between one man and one woman, and they obviously haven't read their Bible very carefully, or they would know it was full of polygamy. In the state of Wisconsin, we have, unfortunately, the religious right has got this referendum on our ballot this fall. And the state of Wisconsin is a mixed bag. Voted for Kerry in the last election, not particularly conservative out of our capital state of Madison, but liberal out of our capital state of Madison. But there is a coalition working, and we really hope truly to become the first state in the country that turns away this referendum. So far, every anti-gay referendum that has been put on a ballot has passed, and the reason is because of the churches. Pastors and priests are allowed to go up on their pulpit, pound it with their Bible, and tell their parishioners how to vote in a referendum. It is not considered political. And there are far more conservative churches than liberal, so it's really an unfair battle, and we'll have to see. We'll work very hard to defeat that. And let's see, I just make a few references to some things going on worldwide, and then I'll stop. Of course, I wish that the United States was importing secularism instead of war and imperialism. Since our invasion of Iraq, the women there who had Western-like rights have lost those rights, have virtually disappeared. I was taking notice in recent theocratic trends around the world. This June in Mogadishu, the senior Muslim cleric there urged, I don't know if you noticed this, a war with infidels over the imposition of Sharia in Somali. He demanded that all Somalis must defend the Islamic courts and Sharia law as a war against the infidels and against the godless invaders. And Sharia is basically the Old Testament law brought to life. You know, stone women who aren't virgins on their wedding day, stone adulteresses. Usually you don't stone the men because they can have multiple wives and divorce them. Gays are stoned. The veiling and house arrest, of course, comes from vaguer Quranic references. This summer, photographs of women in veils, I don't know if you caught this, in Saudi Arabia have been banned. They would incite men, I guess, to consider women as human. We have a assistant in our office from Malaysia. She's not a Muslim Malaysian, she's Chinese Malaysian. But I took special note in March of what happened in Malaysia. The daughter of the former Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, has been writing a column for one of their English-speaking newspapers for 17 years. And on International Women's Day, of course, March 8th, she wrote a column that was banned, and it was banned because she made comments about the status of Malaysian women and religion in her own country, pointing out that non-Muslim Malaysian women have benefited from many reforms, whereas Malaysian Muslim women's rights have gone in the opposite direction. Divorce formerly had to be by mutual consent, and now Muslim men can even divorce their women by cell phone. She wrote, "Muslim women are gagged and bound under the guise of religion." And of course, I think what we're starting to see in the Muslim world are some women freethinkers. In the Western world, it took the women freethinkers, the unorthodox, to dissent from Christianity and to work for their rights. Women such as Mary Wollstonecraft, who basically wrote the first book on behalf of women's rights. The international Frances Wright and Ernestine L. Rose, who came to the United States, fortunately, and worked for women's rights there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the first woman anywhere in the world to call for women's right to vote. And it was not a coincidence that she was a heretic, an agnostic, devoting the end of her life to freeing women from the degradations of superstition. I noticed this pen. I don't know who was selling this. No gods, no masters, and that was the motto of Margaret Sanger, the woman rebel who brought us birth control, despite endless persecution by the Catholic Church. So I think that in the Muslim world, we are starting to see the beginnings of a woman's revolt against Islam, which we need. Look at the very brave exile, Taslima Nasrin. But these women are risking death for freedom of conscience. Beliefs inconsistent with the known laws of science and reason have been and are being used to hold women in subjection, to deny women rights, to punish, to diminish, even to terrorize. The union of such beliefs with the power of government is woman's greatest enemy, and secularism is women's greatest friend. Thomas Paine would say now is the time for all good freethinkers to come to the aid of secularism. Freethinkers worldwide need to redouble our efforts to fight the emerging disenlightenment, because that's what we are facing in the United States. We have a friend who's a wonderful poet, Philip Appelman, and he emailed us a new poem. It hasn't been published yet, but I'll read 2 lines of it. "Winds are blowing cold above the city, and lights are going out around the world." Author Robin Morgan, she's an American, has pointed out that women's rights are kind of the canaries in the mines, and in America, that means we've got a lot of work to do.